my pleasure to introduce our two panelists for tonight. I will start with Kathleen. Kathleen Fitzgerald is the project director Enduring Earth at the Pew Charitable Trust, a former vice president at the African Wildlife Foundation, a partner at Conservation Capital, and was co-founder and executive director of Northeast Wilderness Trust. Kathleen, it is so great to have you here and welcome.
Thanks, Janelle. Great to be here.
We are also joined tonight by author and biologist Thor Hanson. Thor is a Guggenheim Fellow, a Switzer Environmental Fellow, and winner of the John Burroughs Medal. His many books include Close to Home, Buzz, Feathers, and the children's favorite, The Escape Artist, and Star and the Maestro. Thor's work has been translated into a dozen languages and earned many accolades, including the Phi Beta Kappa Award in Science and 3 Pacific Northwest Book Awards. He's co-hosted the PBS Nature series American Spring Live and has appeared on programs ranging from Fresh Air to Science Friday and Wired Currents. Thor lives with his family on an island in the Pacific Northwest. So Thor, welcome. We are so happy to be here with you tonight, and the floor is all yours.
Okay. Thank you very much, Janelle and Kathleen and everyone at Newt for inviting me to join you here this evening. I'm going to share my screen here, and we're going to have some pictures to go along with the first part of our time together. And there we go. Excellent. So as Janelle mentioned, I am going to start things off by telling you a few stories and reading a few bits out of this book for probably about 20 minutes or so, followed by a conversation with Kathleen, and then a Q&A session at the end. So if you do think of a question as we go along, by all means, don't forget it. Put it into that Q&A box there. Send it along, and I look forward to a good Q&A and a discussion at the end. But to start things off, to really get things rolling, I think that I need to settle one thing, and that is just how I became so fascinated by the nature close to home. And after all, I have studied plants and animals all over the place, all over the world, really. And my last book was focused on the biology of climate change, which is indeed a very global topic. So what made the pendulum swing all the way back to the relatively small geography of things like lawns and shrubberies and backyard trees? Well, the answer to that question is a thump. It's the sort of thump that we all dread hearing. It was the sound of a bird hitting the window of the little shack that I use for an office in our backyard. And I heard that thump and I ran outside to check, and I found a beautiful hermit thrush dead in the grass below the window. And I felt terrible, of course, but I have to tell you, I also felt a little bit embarrassed. A little bit embarrassed because here I am sitting there writing about nature, and I had no idea there were hermit thrushes spending the winter in my yard just a few feet from where I was working. And this is a bird that is famous in both of my lines of work. Now, biologists are fascinated by the way that hermit thrushes can sing 2 notes at the same time, and they do so in precise harmonic intervals that are eerily similar to the minor chords and scales used in human music. The resulting song is so haunting and so beautiful, it has become a powerful metaphor in literature, invoked by hundreds of authors and poets, since before ornithologists even knew which bird was responsible. If you read T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, you will find a hermit thrush singing away in that epic poem. And if you were to read Walt Whitman's wonderful elegy for Abraham Lincoln, titled When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed, he felt that only the song, the haunting song, what he called the wondrous chant of the gray-brown bird, was adequate to convey the nation's grief. So, as a biologist and a writer, failing to notice a species that's so well known in both of my chosen trades really begged an obvious question. What else was I overlooking in my own backyard? So finding answers to that question led directly to this project. I climbed trees, I dug holes, I crawled on my hands and knees, and I sat inside a pile of sticks, stock still, listening and watching. While I did these things, I found an incredible array of species doing things that I had never imagined, from yellow jackets, fierce yellow jackets, peacefully sipping honeydew in the treetops, to the robin, the innocent robin, brutally attacking a Pacific tree frog. Now, you might say, well, sure, you have wildlife in your yard, Hanson. You live on a rural road on a rural island in the far northwest corner of the Pacific Northwest. Fair enough. But I submit to you that there are biological mysteries everywhere, even in the most urbanized landscapes on the face of the planet. And to prove that point, I want to share now a story straight out of chapter 3 of the book, which begins with an epigraph from Tolkien, who wrote, "There is nothing like looking if you want to find something." It started with a wager at a lunch party. I had been bragging, perhaps unwisely, that I could find a new species anywhere, Brian Brown told me over a Zoom call. His dark hair and boyish face belied more than 30 years employed at the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles, where he currently serves as curator of insects. He made that fateful new species boast at a donor luncheon, and one of the museum's trustees immediately took up the challenge. If Brown could find a new species of insect in her backyard, she told him, she would host a grand dinner party fundraiser in celebration. To add a bit of pressure, she went ahead and scheduled the party. "I didn't manage to get the trap set up until 3 weeks before the dinner," Brown recalled, but any angst he felt about the situation disappeared as soon as he brought that first batch of specimens back to his lab. With a practiced eye, he began sorting out small flies in the family Thoridae, his specialty. "The very first one I looked at didn't key out to anything," he said, referring to the technical manuals or keys used in taxonomy to tell one species from another. To someone of Brown's experience and expertise, that could only mean one thing. "It was unknown," he said, still visibly excited years after the fact. The second fly he examined had what he called a, quote, weird leg, and it turned out to be the first North American record of a species known only from Europe. Then he found one from a genus never before recorded west of the Rocky Mountains. "I didn't even have to finish looking through the sample," Brown went on. "I already had enough for the party." More than that, he had confirmation that backyards in cities were worthy of exploration, and that gave him the beginnings of an ambitious new research program. "The BioScan project is unique," Brown explained, ticking off the features of an effort now in its 11th season. Where most biodiversity surveys explore rural places and wildlands, BioScan is focused on greater Los Angeles. And where most surveys inventory a wide range of life forms, Brown's group decided to go, quote, narrow and deep, studying specific insects like phorid flies and bees. They've sampled from the urban core to the edge of the city, and from the coast inland to the desert, and they have consistently avoided designated natural areas, targeting instead the sorts of places usually overlooked by biologists: backyards, gardens, and small neighborhood parks. The results have been no less remarkable than those first few flies from the trap in his trustee's yard. "There's no end to it," Brown exclaimed. "Every time we sample in a new area, we get new species. For phorid flies alone, the team has discovered 50 species new to science and expanded the known ranges of scores of others, and they still have thousands of specimens left to examine." To Brian Brown, the success of BioScan's backyard strategy is gratifying, but not surprising. He finds similar untapped diversity wherever he looks for flies. Phorids are his forte, but the entire fly order remains poorly known. Over 160,000 species have been described, but there are perhaps 10 times that number waiting to be discovered. Or maybe more. Nobody knows for sure. As Brown put it, the magnitude of the richness and of our ignorance is beyond what we're used to thinking about. Now, I love Brian's story because it shows that every backyard contains mysteries worthy of attention. And it also shows the power of collaborations between scientists and anyone with an interest in nature. Because all of those discoveries were made in partnership with the people living in those neighborhoods, homeowners, school kids, gardeners, and other residents. The traps became so popular, Brian told me, that people actually lobbied to get them into their yard, and more than one person cried when it was time to take the trap down and move it to a new location. There were times, of course, when that enthusiasm led to problems. The data from one particular yard went absolutely haywire week after week, and they couldn't figure out what was going on until the little girl who lived there proudly announced to her parents that she had been helping the scientists by catching her own bugs and stuffing handfuls of them into the trap. So that theme of scientists and citizens working together on backyard studies occurred again and again in my research for this project. And it makes sense. Let's face it, there's a lot of data out there in the world, and there are only so many scientists. But with the advent of all of these online tools and cell phones, or sometimes just a plain old jar with a lid, people's backyard specimens and observations are being used to answer all sorts of important and intriguing questions on everything from climate change to pollination, invasive species, amphibian populations, even the discovery of new drugs. One example of that I can't help but point out would be from the soil fungi found in a single sample from one backyard in suburban Fairbanks, Alaska, submitted to a project at the University of Oklahoma, has already yielded a promising new drug for the treatment of breast cancer, as well as a compound that strangely eliminates odors in an instant. Anything they threw at it, wolf urine, no problem. Skunk odor, no problem. Not surprisingly, this compound has already been licensed by a company in the pet industry, and you may encounter it in your kitty litter soon. But among all of these various research efforts, fascinating though they may be, there are some that are asking even deeper questions, not just what is out there in the yard, but what are those creatures doing? And the next story that I want to tell you is about one of those efforts. It comes to us from Sydney, Australia, where a German behavioral ecologist named Barbara Klump began advertising on the radio in 2018, asking people throughout the metro area the same question. Had they ever seen a parrot opening the lid on their garbage can? We were also interested to know if they hadn't seen it, Klump clarified when I reached her on a video call. It was crucial that we could also say where the behavior doesn't happen. By including that key detail in her protocol and by racking up reports from over 1,300 participants in 478 different suburbs, Klump was able to pinpoint 3 neighborhoods where the bin opening technique had been mastered. It helped that the behavior was so distinctive. Anyone would notice a parrot strewing garbage around their yard. It also helped that the bird was so distinctive. Among Australia's 57 parrot species, only one is large and snowy white, with a comical plume of yellow feathers flopping around on its head. Sulfur-crested cockatoos are really ideal for this kind of study, Klump told me. Intelligent and highly social, the birds live in what she called a fission-fusion system, dispersing in small flocks to forage during the day, the fission, and then gathering together again at large communal roosts to spend the night, the fusion. The foraging parties change constantly, giving them lots of opportunities to learn behaviors, she explained, and that learning process lay at the heart of Klump's research interests. After making a name for herself studying tool use in Hawaiian and New Caledonian crows, Klump embarked on the cockatoo study as part of a postdoctoral fellowship based at the Max Planck Institute of Animal Behavior in Germany. The project took shape quickly as soon as she and her colleagues documented the bin opening behavior and showed that it was brand new, limited to just a few birds in a handful of locations. "Oh my God," she said, remembering her first glimpse of a cockatoo in action. And to give you an idea of just what that looked like, Barbara was kind enough to share this video, which I will now play for you through the wonders of the internet. This was shot during the early days of her project. There, get it open. Walk it back. Now, snack time, and the other bird flies in at the end. I love that video. I love that. You thought raccoons were bad. There are flocks of these things all over Greater Sydney, Australia. They're a menace, I tell you. So when Klump first saw this, she told me that it brought all of these questions. It just brought all of these questions. How did they figure it out? Do they all do it in the same way? Is this a socially transmitted behavior? And finding answers would require a lot of data, far more than she and a few student helpers could ever accumulate on their own. We couldn't have done it without the citizen scientists, she said, and explained how she continued her online surveys for years, gathering observations from thousands of residents all across Greater Sydney. Some of them still keep in touch with her, sending pictures, notes, and videos of bin opening and other cockatoo antics playing out in their neighborhoods. Now, because Klump's team had thought to document both the presence and the absence of bin opening birds, and because they had spotted the behavior so soon after it began, they found themselves in a position to map its spread. And from those 3 original neighborhoods, the ability to open garbage cans swept through cockatoo populations in an additional 41 suburbs in only 2 years. And as it diffused, the behavior began to change. It's a difficult task for the birds, Klump explained. They try, and they often fail. And that profusion of repeated attempts gave the cockatoos ample opportunity to experiment and to develop variations on the original technique. Some grabbed the lid with their bills. Others used a foot or a foot and a bill together. Some walked to the right along the rim. Others went to the left. Some birds sidestepped. Others walked straight. All of those nuances could be mapped as well, and it quickly became apparent that the birds were doing more than just learning from one another. They were developing distinct neighborhood styles. And when a socially learned habit begins to vary geographically, taking on unique traits in different populations, behavioral ecologists have a word for it. They call it culture. Now, this is the same way that we define culture in human societies, behaviors learned from those around us that vary with geography in different populations. It's why Italian cuisine is different from the food found in Mexico, which both stand in contrast to the pickled herring and lutefisk enjoyed by Norwegians. At least that's what I was always told as a child. I had to eat my lutefisk because it was part of my culture. Now, to be clear, finding evidence for culture in wild animals is extremely rare. You have chimpanzees passing down different techniques for tool use. You have certain whale and dolphin populations with distinctive feeding behaviors, and there are some clever crow habits that do seem to vary geographically. But that's about it. So Klump's work was highly significant. It was a headline-making discovery made not out in the wilderness, but in people's yards and driveways, and it continues to bear fruit. Her team is now studying how people react to cockatoos, because nobody wants their garbage strewn all over the place. So they might put out a rubber snake to scare the birds away, or they might try to weigh their lids down with bricks. And those behaviors also vary by geography as people copy what their neighbors are doing, and as the cockatoos then learn to overcome those defenses. It has turned into what Klump calls an innovation arms race. And that, I think, is another important aspect, really, of the nature close to home. What we see in our yards and neighborhoods can affect our own behavior. And in a lot more ways than, putting a snake on a trash can. When that poor hermit thrush hit my office window at the start of this project, I immediately went out and bought a roll of translucent bird tape, put it up, and I haven't had a bird strike there since. Which led me to another running theme for the whole project. Not just what's out there in the yard, not just what it's doing, but what we can do to help it. Simple things that can improve habitat and measurably increase the biodiversity of virtually any patch of ground. And in an era of global environmental crisis, when the challenges often seem so vast, I argue that personal, hands-on efforts with tangible results have never been more important. We need the uplift from these hyper-local efforts to stay energized for the broader fight. And the last story that I want to share with you involves an attempt to do just that right in my own yard. It also begins with an epigraph, this time a little farther back in time. This is from Horace, who wrote in 20 BC, "You may drive out nature with a pitchfork, yet she will ever hurry back." That should take care of it, I thought, stomping with my heel to pack dirt and gravel around the base of the new signpost. For several years, my efforts to nurture a patch of thimbleberry bushes at the head of our driveway had been repeatedly thwarted. They'd come up on their own, a native species related to the common garden raspberry that would bear similarly delicious fruits if they ever got a chance to mature. But while I'd been careful to trim back the brush and grass around them, their position near the road made them vulnerable to our local county maintenance crew. Twice in a row, just as the canes got tall enough to flower, a passing mower had whacked the whole thicket back to ragged stumps. This season I was determined to prevent that from happening again. With the thimbleberries once again grown robust, grown leafy and ready to bloom, I had put up a notice to keep all would-be shrub cutters at bay. Stepping back to admire my handiwork, I stopped short. And I found myself doing the sort of cartoonish double take usually reserved for slapstick comedies. Was I losing my mind? The words I'd painted on the sign made no sense. Well, worse than that, they encouraged the very behavior I was trying to stop. It seemed impossible, but there was no denying the instructions now printed beside my precious thimbleberries in large block letters. Mow on. If you turn those words upside down and read the phrase again, you will immediately realize my mistake. And I'm happy to report that once I had the sign properly oriented, it served its purpose admirably, and our thimbleberry patch has been thriving ever since. In springtime, we always enjoy its flush of broad green leaves and the pale flowers that come along next, followed in early summer by a tasty harvest of those small crimson fruits. Those rewards were an ample return on investment, but to be honest, I considered them something of a side issue. It wasn't until I spotted a woody burl gnarling one of the canes that my true goal was realized, and I knew that in one fell swoop I had increased the biodiversity of our yard by as many as 14 species. Now, I don't have time to tell you all about that now, but I can tell you that the story has to do with wasps, has to do with parasitism, it has to do with predation, reproduction, and it has to do with the career of a famous sex researcher named Alfred Kinsey. Which leads to another takeaway from studying nature anywhere, but certainly close to home. You never know where your interests might take you. And with that, I thank you for your attention, and we are going to stop this share and start in, I think, on a bit of a conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tor. That was incredible and so interesting. I know here in the Northeast, people are always worried about bears getting into their trash, but thankfully we don't have parrots trying to get in there. Um, I just wanted to say, loved all of that. I'm a big bird person. And hermit thrushes are one of my favorite birds. And they're just now making their way back into the Adirondacks, so I'm so excited to be welcoming them home, or
Good.
to their summer homes at least. Um, and there's also excited to welcome Kathleen back to the screen here. And so before we begin this conversation between you, Tor, and Kathleen, I just want to remind everybody quick that if you have any questions, anything that popped into your brain during that presentation, please submit it through the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen, and we will get to those shortly. Before I step back into my observer role, just like to pose a question to get this ball rolling, get the conversation going. And Tor, this one is for you. Can you speak a little bit about your transition from your first book, on mountain gorillas, to the tiniest of subterranean species that are in your latest book?
It's an excellent question. I'm going to twist it around, and I think I'll answer it by posing another question right to Kathleen. And this question has to do with when we were in graduate school together many years ago. And in the program we were in, we would always go on a lot of field expeditions, but every Friday there'd certainly be a Friday field walk. And I want to ask Kathleen, how far did we make it out of the parking lot before we had to stop and look at something?
There you go, Tor. Um, we didn't make it very far. And I'm so glad you mentioned, just for everyone, Tor and I know each other from the University of Vermont Field Naturalist program. And it's an amazing program that continues today. And it really is about training naturalists to read the landscape, but also to translate that into policy action and making it accessible to citizens. And Tor, I can't think of a better, representative of the FM program than you. And I just think it's amazing what you've done, and in this latest book in particular, of translating the stories of all these scientists around the world into accessible information. So thank you for your reading. And for those of you that have not read, no, I'm not getting a cut on the book sales, but Tori, you referred to this, crawling around on all fours, right? Climbing a tree and literally licking the twigs to see what's happening, sitting in a stick pile. And I think it all goes back to that curiosity, right? And if you go back to the Friday field walk, it was always about being curious. And as you say, I think in your book, something about, you probably will say it much better than I, but that curiosity is essential for connecting to nature. So I'm going to throw it back to you and ask, throughout this project, you interacted with so many incredible citizen scientists as well as published scientists. Does it give you hope that there are all these individuals that are deeply curious about what's happening in their backyard?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, when you think about getting out there and looking at stuff, and this is why I wanted to bring up those Friday field walks right off the bat, because sometimes we wouldn't even get out of the parking lot. There's so many things to look at. The questions would start to flow. Why? Why? What's that? What's that? What's going on? And we could see that that curiosity in all of us brought out sort of in this collective form. So in terms of the journey then from, going from mountain gorillas to these small things, it could go in any direction. If it's a curiosity-driven enterprise, which I believe that biology really is, and I believe that there's a bit of a biologist in everyone, right? We have this inherent interest in things out there. And that's what really you see tapped into with these projects that feature these collaborations, with citizen scientists, with trained professionals, and so forth. It's the curiosity that brings it all together. And I think there's something important about including the small creatures in these efforts, in that, we're all in our work, I think, trying to communicate, trying to build, if you will, a constituency for nature, a constituency for science, in that we look around and we see that the human connection to the natural world is frayed at best in the modern day and age, when we are all so distracted by screens, when we live in this increasingly indoor media and technology focused world. Those connections to the natural world have become frayed. And so if we were only to wait until the rare chance to visit the mountain gorillas to connect with nature, or if we only wait until we have time to take the holiday and get to the national park, Those things are all important. Those things are great if we can do them. But it misses out on this opportunity to connect with the nature that we're close to and living with and amongst all the time. And so smaller things or things that are close to home, things that are in our neighborhoods, I think are essential for trying to reestablish those ties. And those ties are essential, I think it's for building up the idea of a population, a society that values nature, that values science, that values conservation.
Tor, I'm so glad you said that. And for those of you that don't know, I'm based in Vermont, and Northeast Wilderness Trust works in 6 states across the Northeast. And so timing, Tor, is perfect, right? As Janelle mentioned, this is the last webinar because now we're all going to get outside, right? Because the snow is melted. It's getting a little bit warmer, although we had snow yesterday. But I love the timing of this in terms of just starting to pay attention to what's happening out your front door. I also appreciate in the beginning of your book, Tori, you really clarified that, and you said this in your opening remarks, you don't have to be on an island off of the coast of Washington. You don't have to have your own backyard. It could be walking in a park in your town or your city. And the diversity of experience that you describe in your book of people, that have small parks or have yards, I think is really inclusive, and I appreciate that.
Yeah, I've heard from so many people and talked with folks about these topics now for a couple of years, and one of my favorite stories, it's not in the book, but it was a conversation with a couple who live in an tall apartment building in Chicago, and they got permission to replace the little patch of shrubs at the where you go out of the building to get to the parking lot. There was a little sidewalk, patch of shrubs on one side, patch of shrubs on the other, non-native stuff, nothing happening. And they got permission to replace one patch. So they pulled out the shrubs and they started planting, some native wildflowers and grasses and so on and so forth. And within a season, they started seeing native insects and also birds visiting that tiny little patch. And grudgingly, the superintendent said, "All right, well, no, all right, you can have the other patch too." So now they have, I think, both sides of the sidewalk there in these little patches. But it gets at the potential for connecting and also for doing bits of restoration that can improve habitat in the most unlikely places. I had a conversation with, boy, someone in Massachusetts, actually, who used this phrase that I just loved, talking about, the ability for little insects and other creatures to find native plants. If you bother to put them into your yard or into your shrubbery in Chicago, wherever you are, because so many of these creatures, they locate their habitat by using olfactory cues, using chemical cues. They smell this stuff and they home in on it. And she called all of those little creatures aerial plankton. And I just love that image of the plankton is out there drifting around in the sea of air above us. And when you plant something they recognize, they will come down to your little patch and find it and make a home there. So there really is this potential for, somewhat very rare in conservation, instant gratification. When you start doing these small restoration efforts, you can really see quick results.
So, Tori, you mentioned in your remarks soil, and I'm going to have to embarrass one of our participants, Brett Angstrom, who is a board member of Northeast Wilderness Trust, who is mentioned in your book. Can you tell us a little bit about Brett and what you learned from Brett and how that resulted in a hole in your yard?
Brett, good to connect with you briefly here via the Zoom. This goes back to a story again from our days at the University of Vermont, and this is a game that naturalists of all kinds play. I don't know this. At the risk of sounding a little nerdy, perhaps this is a natural history sort of drinking game or something. But you sit around and you ask, well, now if you could be in the field with only one tool, one piece of equipment, what would it be, to do your research? And the typical answer is usually, binoculars, which is great, or a hand lens to look at small things. Occasionally you'll get someone who said maybe a thermometer. But in all the times that I have asked that question or heard it posed to a group of people, only one person, Brett Engstrom, said, "Oh, a shovel." And I was amazed when he answered it that way. I think, Kathleen, you were probably there with me. Like, really? Well, tell us about the shovel. And he was leaning on a shovel as he gave the answer. And so he demonstrated what he meant. And the idea was that if you really want to understand what's happening in any patch of ground, you need to look below the surface. And the soil conditions, how the soil is made from whatever the parent material is, the chemical processes there, the nutrients in the soil, all of those conditions will determine the plants that can grow there. And the plants then will determine the insect and the other fauna that inhabit the site. So if you really want to understand any patch of ground that you're standing on, you've got to get the shovel and get in there and get your hands dirty. And so I thought of Brett when I did that very thing in my own yard at home as part of the research for the book. Got to get the shovel out.
Amazing. I have to ask I think it's at the end of the book, you mention three cartoon characters, right? Mickey Mouse, Scrooge McDuck, and who was the third? I had to look up Scrooge McDuck because I didn't know who it was. Spider-Man.
Oh my goodness. Yeah.
I know, I didn't know who it was. So
Spider-Man was third.
what do the three of them have to do with biodiversity?
So this is a way to respond to a question that people ask that I really think, is an important question. You'll hear this in one form or another from all sorts of people out there in the world. And the question is this: when you're talking about conservation of biodiversity and, the number of species, do you have 14 species of gall wasps in your yard or zero? Does it matter? These sorts of things. What does it matter? People will say, they might say, my goodness, someone just opened the back door. Anyway, they might say, well, who cares? Who cares whether you have biodiversity or not? Why is biodiversity important in the first place? And the reasons, or the way that I like to explain, of course, many answers to that question. But I think that the general gist can be described by those three familiar characters. You've got your Spider-Man, you've got your Scrooge McDuck, and you've got your Mickey Mouse. So you start with Spider-Man. And for those who don't know the story, it's the story of young Peter Parker, who's bitten by a radioactive spider, and he begins to develop all of these strange abilities. And the theme that anchors the comic books, the movies, the whole series is this: with great power comes great responsibility. That is the inner struggle that he goes through, trying to decide how to use these powers, and to use them for good or evil or what have you. That's the anchoring question or theme. And so it turns out to be very relevant in the real world in terms of biodiversity, in terms of conservation, because never before has one species, our own, been able to determine the fate of so many others, right? So with the great power that we have comes great responsibility. It is an argument about stewardship and our responsibility to caretake the other creatures of this planet because of the great power that we have. So that, is one way to answer the question of why protect biodiversity in the first place? Well, we have a responsibility, but that, tends to, involve questions of right or wrong, and some people may not agree with you. So you need to have other answers in your toolbox, and one of those then refers to Scrooge McDuck, who you may or may not know, but Scrooge was the famously wealthy and famously cheap in his way, held on to his wealth. He was miserly, uncle of Donald Duck. And he lived on this, on the hill above Duckburg, and he had this great money pit where he kept his fortune, and he would swim around in it and paddle a boat around inside the money pit. And he lived really by the theme that can be summarized by, what's in it for me? Always looking for the profit motive. fortunately, that is also a great way to think about biodiversity conservation, because no matter if you believe in your heart that other species have intrinsic value, as you include, of course, beautifully in the theme for the Wilderness Trust, whether you believe that or not, you can't argue against the fact that many species out there have great monetary value to our species, that Scrooge McDuck would find all sorts of ways to make a profit from other species. If you look at any number of examples, whether you're talking about industries like forestry or agriculture that, of course, depend upon other species entirely, or whether you're talking about things like bioengineering, where you get inspiration, biomimicry from the natural world to human inventions. If you stand inside a Home Depot and wonder why it is you're so comfortably warm there in the checkout line, when if you step out of the checkout line, you're cooler, and it's because that there is a heater above the checkout line that focuses the heat from the heater onto the checkout line, was inspired by the facets found within lobster eyes. Any number of these examples coming from nature. We have adhesives in surgery that were inspired by the slime from slugs. We have, think of the coronavirus vaccines, the Novavax, where if you want to make the vaccine, well, you need to grow up the proteins inside the cells of an owlet moth, and you have to add in a dash of extract from the Chilean soap bark tree. You need those species to produce that vaccine. So many examples of the Scrooge McDuck answer to the question. And then the third would involve Mickey Mouse, which is not a question about profit, not a question about ethics. It's a question about consequences. And you may remember his most famous role as the sorcerer's apprentice, when he steals his master's magic sorcerer's hat and gets into all kinds of trouble when he orders a broom to do his chores for him, and the broom soon floods the workshop with water when it fetches a pail from the well, and then continues fetching pails, and then there are more and more brooms, and the whole place is flooded, and Mickey is awash, paging through the spell book, desperately trying to find a fix for this problem. And I would argue that even the most experienced biologists are just like Mickey, paging through the spell book of nature because we understand it so poorly. And that means that when we start removing species, losing biodiversity from any habitat, we really don't understand the consequences. We don't know what we're messing with. And so that is the Mickey Mouse answer, if you will, to why these things are important. So those are how our comic book characters come to the fore in explaining these things.
Amazing. I love that description. I think everyone will remember that, right? It's you can connect to those characters. So thank you for that.
I had a guy, I gave a lecture where someplace down in Oregon, and there was a guy who came up afterwards and said, listen, I'm only here because, his in-laws, had planned the evening and he got stuck at this thing. But he said, that Spider-Man thing. And he came over and he gave me a big hug. He said, I love Spider-Man, All right, this is the guy I was trying to reach.
Whatever it takes to get someone to connect to that message of stewardship. That's fantastic. Thor, your last book, I know we're talking about the new one, but this one, right? Hurricane, Lizards, and Plastic Squid. Our conversation about the Field Naturalist program reminded me of a couple of the researchers and scientists in that book that you profile. The impression I had is oftentimes they would go into a project thinking they were going to focus on this thing, and then they'd have to pivot. And I was curious, I suspect there are some young scientists and field naturalists, or maybe not young field naturalists or scientists on this webinar. But am I right in remembering that correctly? And any advice, given your incredible field experience, in terms of being open to where the research takes you?
I truly think this is one of the most common themes in field biology right now. And that is you get out expecting to study something, you've thought up this hypothesis, you've got your methods, you're going to go out there and you do your project. And you arrive at your field site, and the conditions are so different from what you expected because things are changing so rapidly. And I mean that not only in terms of the climate conditions, but in terms of the lives and behaviors of the plants and animals that you may be there to study. That you need to bear that in mind and be able to pivot, as you say, to whatever's going on and document that. And that came up again and again, and it still does when I'm talking to people all over the place about the work that they're doing. One of my favorite examples of that comes from Kodiak Island up in Alaska, a fellow named Will Deasy, who went up there as a graduate student to study the relationship between brown bears and salmon. I mean, and it's just axiomatic that we think brown bears love salmon, and this is how it goes. And Kodiak Island has the biggest brown bears anywhere, and they've got tons of salmon in the streams, and that's the connection. And Will was fascinated by this, and he wanted to study and understand how it was that the brown bears always knew which watershed to be in at the peak moment of peak salmon productivity. Right? Because the salmon streams kind of go off. They fire off at different times, and the bears are always there. They're always there. So he was going to study this, and he set up ways to count fish in 4 different watersheds. So he knew when the peak was happening. He radio collared, darted and radio collared 40 brown bears so that he could, monitor their activities. And everything was going swimmingly until all the bears left. Right in the middle of peak productivity at this stream where they were studying, the bears they picked up and they left. And they weren't going to the other stream. Where did they go? He couldn't figure it out. The fish were there. They were at peak numbers. He knew that from his data. He said, well, luckily, they were in a position to study this. So, okay, what's going on? So they followed the bears. They had radio collars, and all of them, without exception, had gone up into the hills, and they began to feast upon red elderberries. Now, the idea of bears eating berries is not uncommon, but the general idea was that came later. After the salmon started to wane, bears shifted to berries in the hills, and they'd eat, thimbleberries, and they'd eat crowberries, and all sorts of berries that were there, salmon berries, and so on and so forth, and some elderberries, sure, they eat those too. And that was a time when they would continue bulking up to try to save up energy for the long winter period of torpor. But here they were doing it, they're skipping out on salmon. They didn't understand it. So they started to look at these elderberries, and they realized that elderberries, in his words, are weird. Elderberries are weird berries. Now, at first I thought he must be referring to the smell of elderberry, the way they talk about in Monty Python, your smells of elderberry and so forth. And they do smell a little weird, but he was really referring to the nutritional components of elderberry, and that the vast majority of berries, you think of your raspberries or blackberries that you put on your muesli in the morning. Well, you're not getting protein from those. Protein is a minor component of the vast majority of berries. But the protein content of elderberries is 13%. And that number makes a difference, because if you take a captive brown bear and you present it with a brown bear buffet and you allow it to choose its own diet, a brown bear is not going to go and just eat protein, right? It's going to choose a diet that has about 17% protein and the rest mostly carbohydrates. And so this red elderberry at 13% protein and the rest carbohydrates is very close to the ideal brown bear food, more so than salmon. The brown bears, and you'll see this if you watch bears eating salmon, they are as picky as Norwegians. They go for the fatty places. They eat the belly or the roe. They eat the brain. They hold the fin down with a paw and then strip off the fatty skin. And they're doing that not necessarily for the flavor, but because they're trying to get more fat and less protein, because it's got too much protein. It's one scientist referred to salmon as suboptimal, but another scientist I talked to put it, a little more clearly when he said, "Oh yeah," he said, "salmon that gives bears diarrhea and all the rest. It's not a perfect food for them, but there was no way to understand this until they got out there and saw this happening, where the change in the seasonality, the phenology, if you will, of those elderberries forced the bears to choose. Right? The warmer springtime temperatures was causing elderberries to bloom and then produce fruit earlier, so that they were at peak productivity at the same time as salmon. Where they used to be later in the summer and early fall, suddenly it was a competition. You had to choose between elderberries and salmon. And for the bears, that was a piece of cake. Elderberries every time. So it's a wonderful example of adaptability on part of the bears to change, what they're doing in response to climate change. It's a wonderful example of adaptability on the part of the scientists. Well, my study's out the window, but what's going on? Let's learn about this.
That's amazing. Tor, another in that same book, since we're on that book, and I think there might be some people on the webinar who live in Massachusetts. One of the stories that I really appreciated was the treasure trove of data on plants and birds that came from Walden Pond. And then the scientist you profiled who had the opportunity to then take all that information and analyze that. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Oh, it's so fascinating. Richard Primack, who's at University of Massachusetts, I think so. Anyway, I went to see him, spent a day together. It was marvelous. He had been a tropical botanist, and he switched gears completely when he stumbled upon this Thoreau connection. And initially did this, more from a standpoint of practicality to be closer to home, but it turned out to just build into this incredible study of, again, phenology, the timing of seasonal events in nature. In that he knew that, he could study out at Walden Pond because it had a great history. There were a lot of naturalists who'd been visiting there for years and keeping track of things because it was so famous. So that was a good basis for him. But he didn't even realize that the data went all the way back to Thoreau. And he was well into these studies before, some scholar he was talking to has said, well, you've got Thoreau's plant data. You could look it up there. And he said, what plant data? And it turns out it was hidden away in some archive in a museum, I believe in New York. And so he got access to this. My God, it's like the equivalent of a spreadsheet. So Thoreau was meticulous in his attention to detail, and we remember him for the writing, for the essays. But the writing was just a part of what he was up to out there. He recorded everything. Recorded when the flowers bloomed of every species. So we have a species, when it bloomed, when the first leaves came on, when the last leaves dropped. He would record birds and when they first appeared, when they first sang, when they first saw a nest, when he first saw young. All of these details, and what were the equivalent, all hand drawn, of these sort of spreadsheet style data sets. And he just kept stumbling upon more of them. There were some at Harvard on birds. There were some plants at this other museum. And he assembled this collection and made them available. And he told me this. He said that if Thoreau was now cited as a co-author on all of the papers that are using his data, he would be one of the most prolific climate change scientists of the 21st century. Because what that data allows is the ability to make modern comparisons in changes to phenology. And the changes of timing of events in nature is one of the first things that we notice in terms of climate change. You can see it happening in your own backyard. You see spring coming earlier, whether it's the lilacs blooming earlier, whether it's, the bare fruits, the elderberries are happening earlier. Wherever you live, you can notice these things occurring. And so now with Thoreau's data, that's one of the earliest baselines for comparisons in all of North America at this point. And so it's referred to again and again to see how things are changing. And one of the important lessons from all of Primack's research is, the importance of flexibility. Because if you look at the botany, the botanical flora of Walden Pond and its immediate surroundings, and you do thorough plant surveys out there, you will find that about 200 species that were there in Thoreau's time are now gone. But if you start to look at why, it's not just habitat loss, some of that, sure, but it's still a fairly rural place. So there's still habitat there. But a lot of the species that are disappearing are those, pardon the noise, I think I have a helicopter going overhead. Part of the reason species are disappearing is because they lack flexibility. And so when you look at phenology, as things get warmer in the springtime, some species have the ability to bud out and leaf out immediately and get established. Others remain on the old schedule, right? And so what that does is it puts them at a competitive disadvantage to the species that are flexible and that open up early. They get established, they're getting the light, they grow faster, and they shade out or outcompete these others, and they wink out. One of the clearest ways you can all see it there in the Northeast is by looking up, if you will, about this time of year in your wonderful North Woods, and you'll see that many of the trees have that sort of flexibility, and they're leafing out earlier. Right? But you also know in your woods there that traditionally you have had a wonderful bloom of wildflowers that happens before the leaves come on the trees. Those flowers come up early because they've adapted to that period of time, that brief little window where they can get full sun before the leaves are on the trees. But now that window is getting shorter and shorter because the trees are coming out earlier. Many of those flowers remain on the old schedule. And so that is one of the reasons that things have changed there at Walden and really throughout New England. And we know about it because someone wrote it down. Thoreau wrote it down back in the mid 19th century.
Amazing. Yeah, imagine being that scientist discovering that trove of information.
Oh, yeah, he was just gobsmacked by the whole thing.
Incredible,
And
right? I see Janelle is back on. I wanted to ask one other question before we turn it over to the audience.
Oh, yeah, Kathleen, can I just do one plug real quick? If anybody has any questions, if they're still bouncing around in your brain, any questions for Tor or Kathleen, please add them using the Q&A function right there on the bottom of your screen.
Great. You just interrupt me, Janelle, because I could keep peppering Tor with questions. And you might not be able to answer this, Tor, but I'm curious what you're working on now.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. No, happy to share. The book that I'm working on right now involves biological mimicry. So how species copy one another or copy other aspects of their environment to gain advantage in nature. You can think of it very broadly as sort of adaptive resemblance. You evolve to resemble something, either to hide or to sneak up on something, or you might use mimicry for dispersal. You might use it for reproduction. It's used in all sorts of really fascinating ways in nature. And so I'm writing a book all about mimicry as a fascinating evolutionary example, but also I think it's a really neat way for people to again stir that curiosity. Because if you think about our own lives, there's a wonderful quote. I think it was Oscar Wilde who said, "All people are other people." And what he meant was we're all natural mimics. We learn our own behaviors by watching and observing others. People in the fashion industry will establish a trend that everyone wants to copy. There's a reason that here we are, we're apes, and there's a reason that to ape is also a verb. There's a natural affinity for mimicry in our own species, and I think that makes this particularly fascinating to a broad spectrum of people.
Amazing. Well, looking forward to that. But I do want to ask, can I ask another question, Janelle?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Unless you want to pipe in with, I don't want to take the time if there are questions from the audience.
No, please, fire away.
Tor, when we were talking about hurricane lizards and plastic squid, your last book on climate change, can you tell us the story about the lizards and why lizards are on the cover of the book in your title? What does that have to do with climate change and adaptation?
Yeah, oh, it's a fascinating story, and it's another example of a study that took a turn. And this is from a fellow named Colin Donahue, who was studying these anole lizards. And anole is it's a smallish lizard. They're beautiful little creatures. They're related to agamas and iguanas and so forth, little ones. That is native to the Turks and Caicos Islands in the Caribbean. And he was studying them as part of a larger project that was looking at the effects of invasive species, particularly the Norway rat. And the Norway rat was common on these islands and it was having all sorts of impacts. So the idea was you go out and you study the lizards, you study the vegetation and so on and so forth, and then you eradicate the rats and then you see how the native system responds. And he was the lizard guy. He and his team were doing the lizards. So they went down there and they caught a bunch of lizards and measured them and took all his data and so on and so forth. And then two hurricanes struck the island back to back. Irma and Maria, if memory serves, and just leveled the place. Uprooted trees, knocked over buildings, left the human population reeling, left the natural communities reeling. And needless to say, the researchers put the rat study on hold. That was sort of over and done with. But Donahue realized that it gave him the perfect opportunity to study the impacts of the hurricanes. And that if he was lucky, he might be able to get out there and see what had happened and what these, if there was a measurable change. First of all, did the lizards survive? And if they did, are the survivors, that population, measurably different from the population that he just measured? So he cobbled together some funding. He went back to the Caribbean, and he found himself in this sort of scientific deja vu, repeating the exact same field experiment he had just done 6 weeks earlier. And he did all of this, uh, got a bunch of data. And then the other thing that made his study really stand apart, and he's a brilliant guy. He's so enthusiastic about science. And he's the kind of guy who just keeps thinking about it, keeps, just working the problem, right? Everyone else is at the poolside bar, after work, but no, he's still thinking. And that's probably why it occurred to him, like, let's get back and measure this. And it's definitely why he thought to bring along a leaf blower. From home, he brought a big leaf blower because he realized that to really understand what was going on, you needed to know how lizards behaved in a hurricane. And you can't be out there taking notes in a real hurricane. So he simulated one with the leaf blower on the porch of his hotel room, which I've always loved the image of thinking what the people in the next room thought about all of this. But nonetheless, he then had this stick where he would put a lizard on the stick. He'd turn on the leaf blower and measure the wind. And no lizards were harmed, by the way. He had a soft net to catch all the lizards. They were safely returned to the wild. But when he did that, you would see then the lizards, as the wind increased, their back legs would slip from the stick and they'd hold on for dear life with their front legs. And soon at hurricane force, their bodies would be flapping like a flag in the wind, right? It was incredible. And it explained everything that he'd seen in his data because that population, the survivors, were in fact measurably different. They had larger, on average, toe pads and bigger, stronger front legs, which helped them grip onto the stick. Sticky toe pads and strength. But they also had shorter tails and shorter back legs. And he didn't understand that until he saw how they flapped in the wind and realized that those characteristics reduced the drag on their bodies so they could cling to a stick for a few seconds longer. And in a hurricane, that can be the difference between life and death. And so he went back then in future generation or for future generations of lizards to see how those traits were passed down. They were indeed inherited. He looked broadly across the Caribbean, and anywhere you had a history of strong hurricanes, those features appeared in the lizard population. So it was a wonderful example of not just flexibility, what we call plasticity in biology, not just flexible responses to climate change, but actual evolution beginning to occur. He measured natural selection, not over the course of hundreds or thousands of years, but really within a single field season.
Amazing. What a great story. And I love, in all your books, Tori, you do such an amazing job of profiling these incredible researchers and scientists who, in the case you just shared, someone who brings a leaf blower on a plane and has to bring it through the airport and explain that they want to figure out how lizards are responding to climate change. I mean, it's amazing, but I think that's part of the gift that you bring in your books is telling those stories, which are so gripping and entertaining, but at the same time, you're learning about things like plasticity, right? And I was curious in close to home, going back to your recent book, there are so many scientists and researchers that you profile. And I was curious as I'm reading it, is it, as you're learning more, you're just unfurling more stories and unfurling other research that links to other projects, and then you're reaching out to these scientists, and is that how your process works?
Very, very similar to
Amazing.
really, it's driven by the science. And so I'm looking through, I'm reading scientific journal papers, and if the science is compelling, then I reach out to the people who did the work and see if they'll chat with me about it. And most of the time they will. People are often excited to talk about what they've been up to. So that is really key part of the process of researching the books, reading the papers, and then getting in touch with these people and finding out, how they came up with these ideas in the first place.
Fantastic.
Wow. Yeah, everything's incredible. Thank you both so much for the conversation so far. We're not done yet. We still got a lot of great questions that have come in
Oh,
from the
cool.
audience here. And I think we'll kick it off with one of the big ones, and I'll pose this to both of you. So get ready for this one. How do you have any tips or tricks or anything that you would recommend for people that want to translate their curiosity about the natural world into advocacy for the natural world and conservation efforts?
Oh, oh no, I mean, Kathleen, do you want to start or
Go for it.
it's the hands-on stuff. I mean, if you are enthusiastic about this, as I think we all are, look for hands-on activities that you can do that bring things to life close, to where you live, and try to involve other people when you can. So you spread this, and you can do it, through any number of means, depending on what floats your boat. You can write things, you can get involved in groups, you can teach classes. But one of the themes that I really try to stress to people about how to do this kind of stuff is to let your freak flag fly. I mean, you love this stuff, right? And you don't get up there, in whether it's in prose or whether it's in a presentation, don't get there and apologize for being, I don't know if anyone thinks this is. No, it's interesting. You love it. Let that passion be expressed, because when you're talking with people, it may not be that, gall wasps may not be, fungus gnats may not be their passion. Their passion might be bowling. You have no idea, but the chances are they have a passion. And so they can recognize the passion that you have, and they will relate to that. And that will help them to relate to your topic, right? So the passion is universal. Things like curiosity are universal. So make sure that you remember that when you're communicating, so that people can relate to that, even if they've never heard of a red elderberry in their life.
Completely agree. The only other thing that I would add is there are so many ways to translate this into advocacy. And as Tor was saying, figure out what you're most passionate about. I mean, I have people all the time asking about, is it communications? Is it policy? Is it fundraising? All of those things are relevant for nature conservation. So figure out what is going to make you excited every day and then go for it, because we need everyone.
Yes. Big tent.
Yeah, that's inspirational. Speaking of elderberries here, we got a question. How do the brown bears know that the elderberries were ripe and for eating earlier in the season? And are there scientists that are studying how animals and maybe even plants can understand and know that these changes are happening? Like, are the animals just as curious as we are?
Well, the answer for the bears is almost certainly they're following their nose. They're following their nose. You know, the olfactory cues of fruits. We are relatively limited in what we can smell. But animals have a great capacity to process, chemical information through the air. Most other mammals smell very, better than we do. Insects can sense all sorts of things that we don't even know are happening through those sorts of cues. So that's probably what drew the bears. They knew that something was up because they could smell it. And as to whether or not people are studying, absolutely. I mean, this idea of adaptation, of quick changes going on in nature to respond, is a really big topic right now in biology. So there's all sorts of really great work going on. And one of the reasons to do this work is, it's practical in a sense, in that we're at a point of sort of triage, really. How do we know how to best allocate our resources towards conservation projects, towards conservation research, towards policy goals, right? And so knowing more about the biology of climate change and how species are reacting helps us to make those decisions. Because if you don't know, I mean, if you're worried about every single creature out there, as we are, but you don't know how to prioritize. But if you know these creatures have great flexibility, they're adapting and doing pretty well. These creatures are stuck and they need our help. That helps you make those sorts of decisions. And what I would add to that is that knowing these kinds of things is also important for our own, personal investment in these big crisis, style problems, and that we need to know how to invest our emotional capital because that is also limited. And so knowing about the biology of these creatures and how they are adapting or not can inform us and what we need to really worry about. Maybe there's a creature that you love that is shifting its range out away from your range. You may not see it in your yard the way you used to. And in my case, that's the golden crowned kinglet, which is a bird that I am extremely fond of. And they're less common now, but they're shifting north. And there does seem to be, good habitat for them northward. And they do seem to be making that shift. At least early indications are that they are moving successfully. Now, in terms of climate change adaptation, that's a great outcome. If the species can move, find new habitat, and live there, wonderful. But at a personal level, then I might miss them, but I shouldn't worry about them because they're probably going to be fine. Whereas I might worry a little bit more about a Chinook salmon, which is another species that I share habitat with here in the Pacific Northwest that is less flexible and suffering greatly from climate-driven problems.
Thanks for that, Tor. Oh, Janelle's back.
Oh, yeah, I'm never very far away. Um, we we got another question here, for both of you. Um, and it is from our good friend Brett, who is on the call here. Can you name one of your most spectacular natural or biological events that you've witnessed in your lifetime?
Mm.
Wow,
Kathleen?
Brett, that's really hard. And I'm trying to think of one that involves a shovel, and I'm afraid I'm going to disappoint you in that. I'm gonna duck out of this hard question, Brett, by saying I feel really lucky that I could list a number of different experiences, ranging from right here in the great state of Vermont um, to work overseas. So I just feel incredibly blessed that I've had the opportunity to work in a lot of the world's most incredible places, which unfortunately also are some of the most threatened. But deeply grateful for that, and also appreciate Tor's constant reminder of just paying close attention wherever you are. So you don't have to be in the Serengeti in Tanzania. you can be right on your street in Vermont and see incredible things. So thanks for that question, Brett.
Yeah, I mean, if it's an overpowering question to try to single out anything from the experiences bouncing around in my mind. But I love that point where we have been fortunate, those of us who work in this field, often have been fortunate to see things all over the place and really remarkable things. But we also have the opportunity when we remind ourselves to find something that stands out just in the day or in the course of a season, what really stands out. And then you can really highlight for yourself all of the amazing things that you're encountering, on a very regular basis, and the surprising things and the things that we don't understand. I think I mentioned that, walking through my neighborhood, I had this thought go through my head. This was a couple of years ago. Now I ended up writing a paper about it. I think it ended up in the book, but I also wrote a journal article about this. And I was walking along and you're thinking about stuff and I was like, yeah, frog, doodly doo doo doo, frog. But the frog is in the wrong place. What is that frog? And I looked and I had seen out of the corner of my eye a tree frog. Not uncommon. They're common. They're all over the place here. But it was dangling from the bill of a robin. And that's not something I've seen before. And I couldn't believe it. And so this robin takes the frog up over the pavement and drops it onto the road. In the way that you may have seen, a crow dropping a nut to break it open, or a gull dropping a crab to stun it or to break the shell. Here, this robin drops the frog and then lands next to it and then pounces on it over and over again, jabbing it with its bill. As this poor frog tries to escape, and it gets finally to the edge of the road, and the robin finishes the job and kills this frog in front of me in my neighborhood. And I stand there and I watch and I count the number of times it's stabbing the thing, and is it ever going to eat it? And it can't break through the skin of the frog, so it hammers away at this thing for minutes on end, wasting all this energy till it's finally standing there. And with its bill gaping, exhausted. It's exhausted itself and gotten no nutrition out of the frog, which probably answers the question of why you don't see this more often. It was a complete wasted effort on the part of the bird because it doesn't have the appropriate bill for opening up a carcass. But it just raised all sorts of questions about, two very common species in my world that I had never seen or expected to see interact. So that's one example, but there are many, I think, all around us. And even when we're trying to pay attention, we probably miss a lot of what's going on.
Yeah, I can definitely appreciate that. I was out today on one of the Wilderness Trust preserves in New York. I actually made it my background here on the Zoom. So this is at our Mariah Wilderness Preserve, and there were golden crown kinglets singing the whole time when I was out walking around. So next time I'm over there, I'll pass a message of hello.
Please do indeed.
Let's see. I think we probably got time for one more question, maybe two, depending. And let's dive into something that I think a lot of us are probably curious about. And a topic that is kind of taken the conservation world and turned it all a little upside down. So like at what point does an invasive species become native, or do people consider it native? Does that happen at all? And like for an example, the Japanese knotweed is all over Vermont, and does that maybe not seem like something that is feasible to eradicate?
Yeah, great question. Do you want to take it, Kathleen, or want me to ramble?
You got it, Hanson.
All right, Fitzgerald. So there's a distinction to be made between invasive and non-native that's really important. In that if you look around the flora of a place like Vermont, probably quite similar to here where I live, fully a third of the flora here, at least, is non-native, meaning it's from elsewhere, brought here by human activities, mostly from Europe, but also from Asia as well. So we have this sort of hodgepodge all around us. But it's only a small percentage of those species that truly become what we would call invasive. And those are the ones that spread so quickly, they crowd out native species, from whole sections of habitat. And you see it with your knotweed. You see it with, here we have, Himalaya blackberry, or we have, English holly is a problem now in the forest understory. We're all familiar with examples of this. You've got buckthorn sort of comes to mind, Fitzgerald, if memory serves. So, there's a distinction to be made there. So not every non-native species is a problem. I mean, we all wish we had, fully native ecosystems around us. That's not the case. But still, there are a lot of non-natives that can become naturalized and, muddle along in a small way and not cause that much trouble. So it's really a small percentage of those non-natives, the invasives, that are worth focusing on. And the best advice, for dealing with any of them is to get them early and hit them hard. And the example that we turn to here in my neck of the woods now is what made the press a couple of years ago with a very impressive name, the murder hornet, which is the Asian giant hornet that was introduced probably into at least a couple of different events through shipping containers coming into the port of Vancouver, British Columbia, or maybe here, but probably Vancouver. It seems to have come from the north, and started then spreading and invading down here. So it's a classic example of a species that was non-native and starting to naturalize, meaning it was making nests and surviving and spreading. And the fear was that it would become invasive, meaning that it would spread out of control because it has no predators here naturally, or very few. There might have been a phorid fly that managed to invade the nests and eat some of the detritus, but that doesn't really count. So anyway, so you had these murder hornets beginning to spread, and a great effort undertaken by a whole range of people to try to eradicate it when it was still in its early stages. And it seems to have been successful. Now it's been 2 seasons since anyone has seen them. So that, in terms of advice, either regionally, when you can stop it early, or even locally, if you're managing just a single plot of land, get it early and stay on it, because it's really hard to eradicate an invasive when it goes large scale.
Yeah, that is very true. I know we're combating a lot of invasive or species that are considered invasive and non-native here in the Northeast, but we are all doing what we can to to make the best of the situation. And I think with that, we are probably going to be wrapping this program up. Unfortunately, I don't know that we can all stay up all night talking, though I'm sure I'm sure we all could and probably would enjoy the conversations to be had. But for another day. So on behalf of everyone who joined online today, thank you to Tor and Kathleen for being here and thoughtfully answering all these questions. It's been a great evening. And to everyone who participated on Zoom, thank you for showing up tonight. Your questions were all really great, and it was great to have a good turnout here. On behalf of the Northeast Wilderness Trust, thank you all for your curiosity and passion for wild creatures and wild places. And again for spending an evening with us. I know, at least here in New York, it was very nice out today. Felt like a good spring day. So I know sometimes that's hard to get away from that and get on the computer, but thank you for being here with us tonight. And as you can see on the slide that we have up now, attendees to this program will be sent a post-event email with information on the webinar and other Northeast Wilderness Trust happenings. There is also a link on here for that Forever Wild Circle that we mentioned earlier in the evening. If you happen to be interested in in-person events, there is a calendar with new events added all the time that feature guided walks, as well as guided talks around this Northeast region here. So please do check those out if you are interested in in-person events here. I'm going to take a second to plug myself. I'm hosting one of those in-person events on May 2nd, and we are going to be walking around a preserve here in New York and investigating the curiosity that is known as the beaver. So seeing what kind of things the beavers are up to on preserves. What else have we got going on? I think that probably wraps it all up here for what we have for you tonight. If you'd like to know more about the Northeast Wilderness Trust or Thor Hanson's work, we have links at the bottom of the screen here. So click on those or save them for a later time. Thor and Kathleen, thank you again so much for being here with us all tonight. And thank you, everyone. And I will end on happy spring and happy Earth Day tomorrow.
Great. Thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure and wish you all a happy, happy Earth Day.
Thanks, Tor. Thanks, Janelle.
All right. Bye.